So to start, I'm a girl in her early 20s from the rural Midwest. This past deer season I had a scary experience that I think you all would like to hear. So if you have ever done much hunting, you know that oftentimes you wake up early and head to the tree stand before the sun comes up. It's not bad waking up that early because you're generally so stoked to go hunting you don't even feel that tired. On that morning, I went through my usual routine. Woke up around 4:30 a.m., showered with scent control wash and dried myself off. Put my clothes on, checked my rifle and loaded it, and was out the door. I had to hike a good ways to get to the stand, and it's slow going because even though you can't shoot at the deer that early, you still don't want to spook them, so you have to be quiet and walk slowly. I get close, so I turn off my flashlight and start making it to the base of the stand. I thought I heard a branch or two crack, which was a good welcome sign. Also, this tree stand isn't like the metal frame one-seaters. In fact, it's more of a tree house, a platform with 4 guardrails and camo canvas stapled to the rails, so I have room for a nice chair up there. It's still dark and a hole before I can shoot, so I lean back and start taking a short nap. I doze off fairly quickly, and I know I'll wake myself up in time for the early morning sun. It must have been 15 minutes or so since I had dozed when I hear rustling. It's still not shooting time yet, but early enough that I can see almost well enough, so I start looking around. I don't see anything, so I write it off as squirrels. That's when I hear it, a big thud coming from the base of my tree stand. I was looking out the front at the time, so I spun around to the rear where my ladder is set. It's still dark, but sure enough, there's a man who I can clearly see on the ladder. I didn't know what to do besides tell what the hell and raise my rifle. The guy just stood there looking at me with wild eyes. His hair was unkempt, and he smelled horrid. I tried to speak but couldn't. I was locked in a staring contest with this dude for probably 10 seconds with my rifle raised at his chest. At this point, he starts making weird noises that were really like a mumbling giggle. I've never heard a human make those sounds. I've always told myself if I point a gun at someone, that's when they're going to die. My reasoning is that if I feel the need to use such force to protect myself, the threat is dangerous enough to eliminate it completely. But with all those scenarios I've run in my head, it's always been something like being attacked at knife point or home invasions where I have my pistol. It felt incredibly odd to be pointing my rifle at a person who was just standing there. Finally I said, "Hey, what are you doing?" No response. I got a little more aggressive and yelled that he was trespassing and that this was my property and that he had to leave. He took another step up. I warned him, one more, and I would shoot. He just stood there. He picked up his foot to take one more step and I fired. I didn't shoot to hit him, which was very stupid, but for some reason, I just couldn't do it. Even though I was prepared for it, the sound still shook me every time I fire without hearing protection. My ears ring for days afterwards. I can only imagine what it did to this guy. Luckily, though, out of shock, fear, or a combination of both, he dropped from the ladder. He was rolling on the ground, clutching his head for a few seconds when I got up and ran like a maniac through the woods. I filed a report and installed more security cameras, but nothing came of it. My uncle's father lives in Montana, which allowed us to get resident pricing on big game hunting tags. Once a year, we would head up to his property and hunt for a week. Usually, this would go off without a hitch, and if we were lucky, we would get the shot we were looking for. Unfortunately, not this year. Just like every year, we headed up to his father's property in northern Montana. That night, we headed out to go set up some hunting cameras so that we knew that there were deer in the area, so we knew it was a good place to hunt. It must have been 1 a.m., and we were driving down this 2-lane dirt road, headed into the woods. We were always the only people on the road, since it was so early in the morning. This particular time, we saw a headlight approaching from behind us, but thought nothing of it. We figured they must have been doing the same thing as us. After tailing us for some time, the headlights disappeared, which was strange since there were no turns on this particular road. A few seconds go by and all of a sudden we see the truck driving on the shoulder to our right with the lights off. The shoulder was a small hill with brush and a fence fairly close to it. Definitely something that nobody should be driving on. The truck speeds up and gets back on the road, turns its lights back on, and speeds off into the darkness. This set off some red flags, but we figured they were just impatient and wanted to get there before us. No big deal, or so we thought. We drove down the road for a few more miles until we saw taillights stopped in the middle of the road. It was the truck that passed us a few miles back. They had set up traffic cones to completely block the road off, and there was another truck parked on the shoulder. We figured that they must have broken down, so we stopped. I had read an article online earlier this year about people in other countries that would make roadblocks to rob and kill people for their vehicles and belongings. I laughed and started to tell my uncle about this article when two men from each truck jumped out of their vehicles and started to approach ours. My uncle always kept two handguns on shoulder holsters under his arms when we were out doing these kinds of things. This saved our lives. Two of the men stayed at the tailgate of the truck parked on the road, and the other two men came up to his window. At this point, my uncle has his right hand in his jacket with his hand holding the gun. The men were extremely friendly and said that the truck on the shoulder had broken down, and they were just helping him out. They asked if my uncle knew anything about cars and if he could come take a look at the problem. My uncle refused, and this made the men angry. Both instantly drew pistols, and one of the men rounded the front of the truck towards my window. My uncle grabbed the man's gun that was pointed at him, which he forgot to load a round into, luckily for us. My uncle pulled his gun out and shot the man in the shoulder and slammed on the gas, driving on the left shoulder past all of the men. I looked back and could see the other three men gathering around the man my uncle shot. We drove and drove and drove for what seemed like an eternity, without saying a word to each other. We drove back to his dad's house, and he told me to go to bed. He called the police and told them what had happened. They sent out 2 officers to the house to take his statement and mentioned to him that they had quite a few reports of roadblocks being set up all around northern Montana. They were able to catch all 4 of the men who stopped us that night. When they took the man who was shot to the hospital. So I take my dad's ashes up to Glacier National Park every year. I lived in Colorado when this story happened, and I was headed south through Idaho after I had visited Montana. My car broke down in Salmon, Idaho, and a nice man helped me out. I was headed through the mountains to Boise to visit a friend. It was about a 5-hour drive. Before I entered the truly mountainous section of Idaho, I saw a hot spring on the side of this 2-lane highway along the Salmon River. I decided to take a dip after the stress of having my car breaking down. The hot spring had a bathhouse up at the top near the road and a wheelchair ramp that went down to the area near the springs, where they were on the side of the river. People had created little bath-shaped sections in the river that were separated by river stones. I got out of my car and headed down to the hot spring. I took my dog with me. It was twilight. About every half an hour, a car passed by. Knowing that I was alone, essentially, I took off my top. I was sitting in the hot spring and actually took a photo of a car approaching. The car pulled up next to mine, in front of the bathhouse. It was a truck with 3 men in it. Seamlessly, 1 man got out of the driver's side, and 2 men got out of the passenger side. They moved without qualms and were covered in heavy black gear. They looked like hunters. I couldn't see the expressions on their faces. The driver headed down the wheelchair ramp towards me, not hesitating. He took big, long strides. I recognized that there was danger. The 2 passengers from the other side of the car headed down the steep bank along the wheelchair ramp, taking a shortcut. I was stuck in between both parties. Hastening, I hid and dressed myself underwater while my dog growled. He never growls. I've only heard him growl all of twice in my life, and this was the second time. The driver kept on walking towards me. He walked out onto the rocks into the river, continuously walking towards me even though he was covered in heavy gear that could get him waterlogged if he fell in the river. The other 2 passengers from the side of the car were also walking out on the rocks, directly in front of me. The driver got so close that I had to grab my dog before he lashed out at the driver. I was freaking out. The man was walking out onto the stones so that he could reach me. He was not hesitating. I couldn't see his face. I grabbed my phone, my keys, and my clothes. I dragged my dog in between the 2 parties. The driver would not stop. He turned around very quickly, making an arc, coming for me still. He was still taking big strides. The passengers were walking towards me as well. I was trapped in between them. I ran up the bank, dragging my dog pretty much by his collar all the way into my car. The only way that I could get into my car without them grabbing me was by throwing my dog into the back and lunging myself into the passenger side door of my car. I threw my keys into the ignition and turned them right when the men were walking up between my car and their car. I happened to hit the lock button on the door right when they walked up. Before anything else happened, or before I saw their faces, I ended up throwing myself into the driver's seat, reversing my car, and hightailing it out of there. I drove about 20 minutes down the road. I crossed the river on a bridge and hid my car behind a bank near other campers. It was well hidden from the main road. The campers were looking at me, wondering what was going on.